Welcome once again. This is Pinnacle Professional College, and today we'll be going through the case study for Bazar Company Limited. We'll be delving a lot deeper into the pre-scene information. If you haven't watched the prior episodes, please go watch them. They are on the channel. You'd see parts 1 to 3 already uploaded. So let's go in straight away. So in part 3, we looked at page 3. So now we are moving on to page 4. So let's start with the last sentence on page 3. The GWC structure provides union officials with the opportunity to meet with the senior personnel manager from headquarters, as well as several line managers within the region, right? So we know what the GWC is. General Welfare Committee is basically an intermediary between Bazar Company Limited and the employees, which is basically intended to solve or resolve issues at the local level. The committee would meet up to 3 times per annum at a neutral venue, usually a hotel, and is preceded by a meeting between the full-time officials and representatives from the branches in the area. So it's giving us an insight into the structure of the committee, how meetings will be run, the possible parties involved as a result of this meeting, the issues that are typically dealt with. Now, please take note of these issues, because as I mentioned, human resource and people is something that's really discussed in this pre-scene information, and I'll take time to understand it. In the previous session, I mentioned that I would dive into, human resource models, but I'll particularly focus on one of them, which I think is very comprehensive and very holistic, right? So look at the issues that are discussed here. These are key pain points or problem points or focus areas for the GWC. Number 1 is health and safety, right? The protection of workers. Number 2 is around conditions of employment, terms and conditions of employment. Number 3 is the union reactions to company pay reviews, policies on time off for trade union affairs, and various general items, such as security in stores or information about new opening. Model on central government employees to ensure that Bazar is in line with Ghana labor law. So these are some of the key issues that they are going to be discussing: health and safety, terms and conditions of employment, policies on time off, ensuring that Bazar is in line with Ghana's labor laws, right? So if you've watched my previous episode, you realize that we talked about human resource strategy and what typically should encompass. I talked about the recruitment side, I talked about the retention side, I talked about the remuneration and incentivization side. I also talked about the training and development side, as well as the general well-being of employees. So you would see everything, these 5 key areas in human resource strategy, being captured in the issues that the General Welfare Committee will discuss, which is very interesting. So even before we move on, I said I'll talk to you about an HR model. Now, there are a lot of HR models. I can't go into all of them, but there's one HR model which I find very useful. It's called the Harvard Framework for HRM. The Harvard Framework for HRM. Now, the Harvard Framework for Human Resource Management is a very comprehensive model because it looks at 6 critical components of human resource management. 6 critical components of human resource management. And what are the 6 components or the dimensions? Number 1 is stakeholder interests. Number 2 is situational factors. Number 3 is HRM policy choices. Number 4 is HR outcomes, right? Number 5 is long-term consequences. And number 6 is a feedback loop through these components I've mentioned, right? So there are essentially 5 dimensions and a 6th dimension, which is a feedback loop. A feedback loop is basically an interconnection or an interconnectedness between all the dimensions I've mentioned. So number 1 is stakeholder interests. Number 2 is situational factors. Number 3 is HRM policies. HRM is simply human resource management policies. Number 4 is HRM outcomes. Number 5 is long-term consequences. Long-term consequences. So when we talk about, let's pick the first one, stakeholder interests. We are looking at this in relation to human resource management, right? So here we are looking at employee groups, we are looking at government, we are looking at the community. That's stakeholder interest. We are looking at the employee as a group within the organization and the different stakeholders that have a connection or some form of relationship with employees. Number 2 is situational factors. Situational factors, here we are looking at the workforce characteristics. What are the characteristics of the workforce? What are the underlying features of the workforce? Number 2, you are looking at business strategy and conditions. Number 3, you are looking at the philosophy that is undergirding the human resource management. And in the present information, in our previous episode, we saw that Bazar deploys a unitarist philosophy. Then under situational factors, you talk about the labor market, you talk about unions. So unions fall under situational factors. You have tasks and technology, you have law and societal values. Then the 3rd dimension is HRM policies. Here you are looking at, working systems. What are the systems of work in the organization? What are the reward systems? What are the rewards? Because people do not work for free. So what are the rewards? You are looking at the flow of human resources and you are looking at the influence of employees. What are the policies that are surrounding employees? Very, very important. Then you move on to HRM outcomes, human resource management outcomes. You are looking at key things here. You are looking at commitment, competence, congruence, and cost effectiveness. 4 C's. What are the outcomes that you want as an organization from your human resource management? You want committed employees. You want competent employees. You want employees whose goals are congruent with organizational goals. And you want to also be cost effective when it comes to the recruitment and retention of employees. The 5th point is around long-term consequences. Long-term consequences. And the long-term consequences, you are looking at individual well-being, right? And I mentioned this when I was talking about the 5 key components in human resource strategy. The well-being of the individual, of the employee, it's very, very crucial. You are looking at organizational effectiveness. How effective is the organization when it comes to managing employees? And you're also looking at the well-being, of the employee groups within the organization. So this is what we call the Harvard model. The Harvard model, and you might want to Google it. If you Google Harvard model on human resource management, you see a lot of information, and it will give you ideas as to what to look into when it comes to human resource management strategy, right? Human resource management strategy. So let's move on and go back into the pre-scene information. Let's go back into the pre-scene information. Very, very important. The last sentence of the first paragraph. However, management's approach leans more towards welfare than legal enforcement under court competence jurisdiction, hence not legally binding. So the welfare system is not necessarily, does not have any legal enforcement. It's merely a welfare system. It's not legally binding. It's not legally binding. It's not legally binding. So if you look at some of the typical issues that are going to be dealt with by the General Welfare Committee, if you look at health and safety, this is typically around human resource policies. This is one of the policies that must be put in place. If you look at terms and conditions of employment, this is also a human resource policy that has to be put in place. If you look at the union, that's a situational factor according to the Harvard model. If you look at time off, stuff like that, all these things are workforce characteristics and human resource policies that must be put in place. Pay at Bazar, we're moving on to the second paragraph. Pay at Bazar. Now, when we are talking about human resource strategy, one of the key things is retention. So we cannot talk about retention without talking about turnover. And the way this pre-scene information is delving into people. I would, do a lot of reading or refresh my memory on human resource, because people drive revenue. So if people, you are not getting people to stay, things like that, is definitely going to impact your numbers. Pay as Bazar is determined by management rather than being the subject of collective bargaining, and the system has recently been reorganized through the introduction of new job evaluation scheme. So the pay is determined by management. Remember, the organizational structure of Bazar Company Limited is very, very, very family-centric. So it's a centralized structure, so everything comes from the top. The previous system was felt to be too subjective and open to abuse by managers, favoring specific individuals, a situation compounded by the growth of the company since the previous system has been introduced. So there were flaws. This is a weakness when you're looking at, right? You're looking at the SWOT analysis. Don't forget the 10 key models that I mentioned that you need to know. When you're looking at the SWOT analysis, you're looking at the SWOT analysis, you should know the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right? This is a weakness in the system because you have a very subjective reward system, that favors certain individuals and doesn't favor certain individuals. And this creates friction within the organization, Changes in technology had also rendered some of the previous gradings inappropriate. So when you hear technology and tech, your mind immediately might go to the PESTEL framework, and one of the factors are technological factors. And technology changes and evolves, right? And once it changes, it technically changes, the underlying performance and reward structure of the organization. So for instance, if an individual, an employee is doing something manually in the warehouse, and there's a new technology that's be able to do that, right? What it means is that that employee's performance would have been graded on his manual performance of the job. But once technology replaces that, the performance reward system must be changed to align with the evolving technology. I hope that makes sense. So for example, let's say there's a warehouse worker who was supposed to arrange boxes of products, right? Or boxes of products, different boxes of products. And now there's a new technology that's introduced where there's an intelligent automated forklift of some sort that's able to do the arrangements, right? And so that particular task that is done by the warehouse worker is rendered redundant, right? And so if that employee goes through their performance management or performance evaluation, that particular task is no more, it's no more useful to them because some technology has replaced that work, right? And it's going to shape the performance evaluation of that particular employee. So changes in technology had also rendered some of the previous gradings, for example, in warehouse. So it has rendered some of the previous gradings inappropriate, you see. So some of the gradings have been inappropriate. So another thing I'll be looking at is performance evaluation and performance appraisal. If you haven't refreshed yourself around performance appraisal, please do so. And look at performance appraisal systems, how employees are appraised, So there are different ways of appraising employees, to be fair. There are different ways. And I could mention some, right? I could mention some here just to spark your interest, right? So number one, we have management by objective. It's a performance appraisal method. We have 360-degree feedback. We have assessment center method. For anyone who has gotten a job before and has gone through performance evaluation, you might be familiar with some of these things. We have behaviorally anchored rating scales, which is an acronym. The acronym is BAS. Behaviorally anchored rating scales. We have psychological appraisals. You have human resource accounting method. So these are examples of performance appraisal method. I can go into explaining each of these methods briefly. So I'll touch on a few and explain them briefly. So number one, if you look at management by objective, this is a performance appraisal method. So what exactly does it mean? When we say management by objectives, it's basically a model that seeks to improve organizational performance by clearly defining objectives that are agreed upon between the organization and employees. So management by objectives, clearly defined objectives that are agreed between the organization and employees. So that's one. Two, you have 360-degree feedback. 360-degree feedback. Now, when we say 360-degree feedback, it's quite simple. Even the word 360 degrees gives you an idea. It's basically a process through which feedback from an employee subordinate. So the employee subordinates will give feedback, the colleagues will give feedback, and the supervisors will give feedback, as well as self-evaluation. You see, so you have your subordinates will give you feedback, your colleagues will give you feedback, your supervisor will give you feedback, and you yourself will give yourself feedback. So that's what we call 360-degree feedback. It's a holistic feedback method, a performance appraisal method. And then we also mentioned behaviorally anchored rating scales. Now, so what is this? What is behaviorally anchored rating scales? The acronym is simply BAS, just so you don't go on and on pronouncing a long phrase. So it's basically a tool for evaluating employees in a defined set of performance dimensions, which compares certain behaviors with specific behavior examples. right? So what does this even mean? What does this even mean? So you are comparing behaviors. So you look at incidents within the organization and how employees behave and compare it to what the standard behavior could have been, right? So these are behaviors because they are trying to encourage certain behaviors within employees, right? So these are all examples of performance appraisal methods. So you might want to take a look at that as well. You might want to take a look at that as well. So you have so that's that, right? So let's move on. So moreover, senior management was concerned that the existing system was potentially discriminatory, right? Because those manual jobs, such as those typically undertaken by men in the warehouse, attracted higher rates of pay than those that involved contact with customers. Now that's interesting. For a company that focuses more on customer service and emphasis on high quality service, it's interesting to see that people with manual jobs are paid higher than people who actually have contact. So, the performance or the reward system is not in line with the overall strategy and focus of the company. The overall strategy and value of the company is high quality customer service. So you'd want to incentivize that, right? So people who are involved and in contact with customers, obviously should be making, more, should be making more, such as those typically done by women on the checkout. The new system has 5 grades, right? They have the top grade, which includes craft skills such as senior butchers and bakers, and the bottom grade covers cleaners and trolley assistants, packers. Checkout staff are in the 4th grade. Pay levels are good for the industry. So the new system has grades, right? Now, I'm not necessarily sure if the grades determine your pay. So the first grade gets more and the last grade gets less. I'm not sure if that's how it's working. Maybe the case will tell us more, but if that's the way it's working, then again, people who have more contact with customers should be incentivized. So that's very, very important. That's very, very important, right? And that's what you want in an organization. That's what you would want in an organization. It's very, very crucial. Very, very crucial. So these are the different grades. These are the different grades. I will scrutinize the grades and understand what the implications are, right? What the implications are. But, from what I've learned from the case so far, I can realize that, or I can see or predict that there's potentially, some form of disaster looming when it comes to labor, right? When it comes to labor. And how Bazar Company Limited is structured, doesn't also necessarily help matters with the centralized structure, right? But we'll see as the case goes along. Now let's move on to labor turnover. So labor turnover at Bazar is high at 70% per annum. And in some stores, 150% or more. Wow, that's huge. That's huge. And that's huge. So what's going on here? One of the key things when it comes to human resource strategy is retention. retention. So if people are leaving at such alarming rates, that's a huge problem. What it would mean is that it would impact your training budget, right? Because when people stay long in an organization, one of the things they develop is called institutional memory, right? When they stay long in the organization, they know how the organization works and, and are able to, wriggle their way around things. But when you keep on employing new people, you have to train them, teach them the systems and how the organization works. So it affects your training budget in terms of time and money. So labor turnover is that high. It's very, very high. Very, very high. In stores located in areas of higher unemployment, labor turnover rate tend to be much lower. And at 2 stores that formed the basis for a research conducted, it was 15%. So when I see unemployment, right? When I see unemployment, my mind quickly goes to the Pestel framework again. Now, in the Pestel framework, you have political factors, economic factors, sociological or social factors, technological, environmental, and legal, right? An economic factor could be unemployment, right? The unemployment rate. So it seems that in areas where there are options in terms of employment, the turnover is high, very high. Places where there's less employment, turnover is low. That's an interesting dynamic. And this is having an impact on Bazar Company Limited. So then should the strategy to fix labor turnover, should the strategy be to set up stores in high unemployment areas? But that's a question to answer as we go along into the case. The lowest turnover rate tended to be among the middle-aged women part-timers with childcare commitments. So the lowest turnover rate tended to be among the middle-aged women part-timers with childcare commitments, whereas higher rates were found for the younger women, right? So they saw this among the women. Younger women were leaving in droves, were leaving in droves. So these figures are much higher than in manufacturing, but they are not untypical for the retail industry as a whole. So that's one of the questions I was going to ask. Even though I'm seeing these numbers, what is the industry standard? What is the industry standard, right? What is the industry standard? But it pays to get your employees in the organization to keep on working for you. These crude figures also mask the fact that some of the turnover is as a result of seasonal and temporary employment, as well as the fact that many of the leavers go within the first month of arrival. Wow, so there are people coming. So everything here is talking about turnover and retention. There are people coming and, are like, after the first month, they're like, I'm not doing this again. I'm not doing this again. So how do we fix labor turnover? That's a critical question here. How do we fix labor turnover? That's a question I'll try to answer before the exam, right? How do you fix labor turnover? Right? How do you fix it? So there are different ways to fix labor turnover. Different ways to fix labor turnover. But so let me proffer some or give some general solutions. Number one would be to hire the right people. If you hire the right people and people are actually willing to work for you, that reduces employee turnover. You also have to reward and recognize employees. You also have to give what we call work-life balance. Work-life balance, And you also have to support employees when they need it, because employees are also human and they might need some support. You also must pay attention to employee engagement, how engaged they are. So these are some solutions to labor turnover. As we go along, we'll look at specific solutions in Bazar Company Limited case. So nevertheless, Bazar has made a number of efforts to reduce this high labor turnover figure. And so reduce the cost associated with recurrent recruitment exercises. So you see, once people leave, you must keep on recruiting. And that's also a stress on the HR department. You must keep on recruiting, keep on recruiting, keep on recruiting. And that's not what you want. That will not be ideal as an organization or as an institution. Very, very important. Very, very important. Okay, so much greater effort has been put into the whole selection and induction process, you see. So when I was talking about how to reduce employee turnover, I said hire the right people. So they are putting more effort into the selection and induction process. Because if you select the right people, people who are actually willing to work for you, it is unlikely that they will leave. And in some stores where it is difficult to retain staff, special attempts have been made to attract older people, so-called gray workers in their 50s and 60s, to apply for jobs, right? So in areas where it's difficult to retain staff, they have resorted to, getting older people. Now, the downside of older people is that they are on their way to retirement, on their way to retirement. So that's also a downside. But nevertheless, that's an alternative to solve the retention problem. Getting sufficient applicants has not been a problem in the coastal stores. So they do not have a problem with finding people, although ensuring that these people are satisfactory. So the applications, they do get applications, but getting the right people from the applications has been the problem. Store managers and their deputies complete a short informal interview with potential applicants before the selection process is started, in the hope that this will screen out weaker candidates. Right, so this is quite interesting because they are deploying different methods and different strategies to be able to sieve the right people from the job market, right? So they have a screen interview, an informal interview to screen out weaker candidates. The selection process still relies heavily on interviews. However, they are considering the use of psychometric tests, and this attitudinal test are likely to be introduced for all the staff in the near future. So there are different ways to select candidates. So let me give you some of them, because I see that they are relying heavily on interviews, which is not necessarily a good idea, because your selection process should be comprehensive. So let me give you some examples. Right? So one of the things you could do, obviously, they're already using interviews. Psychometric test is an example. Another thing that you should consider in your selection process are references, right? References is a very, very important thing, references, right? So another test that people use, apart from the so there are different types of tests, apart from the psychometric test, situational test. So they place the candidate in a typical situation in the organization, and see how they respond or react. Right? So these are all examples. Of ways to select employees. Ways to select employees. Ways to select employees. So you have interviews, you have situational tests, you have references, you have technical interviews, you have group assessments as well. Group assessments, you have customer service assessments, etc. So you bring all of these selection tools or mechanisms together before you make a decision. You do not rely heavily on only one. You do not rely heavily on only one, right? Another method that you can also use to bring people into your organization is by depending on already existing employees to bring in referrals of other employees from other organizations. It's also a good way to poach good candidates. Very good way to poach good candidates. So yeah, so that's also a typical example. You have, when you talk about this whole human resource strategy, obviously you cannot leave labor turnover or retention. So I'm excited you have an understanding of that. You have an understanding of that. So that's very, very, very important. Very, very important. So in our next lecture, we'll be looking at page 5 of the case, and we'll be trying to understand how the induction process works, from the recruitment, the selection, interviews, assessment centers, things like that. How does it work? And what measures has Bazar Company Limited put in place to make sure they select the right candidates? Because if you don't catch or get the right candidates, that's when it's one of the huge reasons why people leave. Reasons why people leave. So if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do so. Thank you for watching and have a good day. Bye-bye.